I'm going to work on having Atlas target the cone on cue. So I'm just going to wait for him to finish eating his pellets here, and then I'm going to put out the cone. I'm going to keep it a little bit further away from him so that he doesn't really want to touch it, so he wants to touch it, because right now, just like him seeing the cone is kind of a cue to touch it. And I want to work on actually getting him a voice cue. And then I'm going to give him my cue for just to stand in default. So it's like my left arm over my right arm, as you can see here. I'm going to work on that a little bit, just getting him to stand still. And that's a good practice to have, is just kind of throwing in standing still and waiting into all behaviors. And then I'll go ahead and cue him for the cone. So I backed up the cone, I kind of stepped back, and then I asked him to touch and then pointed at it, and then I'll bring him back, put him back into default. And see, I didn't move the cone far enough away here, so he kind of went ahead and went to touch it on his own. That's totally fine. I'm just going to move the cone out of his space, back him up, re-cue default, and then reinforce him for doing default instead. So I should just move the cone a little bit further, or like if you have a stall, that's a little bit easier because you can put the little um, like rope on the stall door so they can't get to it. But since he's in the pasture, this is what we're working with. So I want to make sure that he gets reinforced quite often for standing in default behavior, and that's more reinforcing than going and touching the cone. And then again, keeping that cone away so that he's less likely to want to touch it until I ask him to. So I'm just going to grab some more food here. I just put a little jackpot on the ground because he had earned that anyway from the behaviors that he was doing. But I don't want to just leave, because that would be negatively punishing him because I'm taking the food away from him. I don't want that. So I do that every time I need to leave him for whatever reason, and then again at the end of the session. So again, queuing for standing default. Right now I'm just kind of like, I'm building up the time that he can stand in standing default. And you can just kind of vary that depending on where your horse is at. So he can stand for a few seconds, then I click and feed him, cue him again. So he's doing about 8 seconds or so there. Looks pretty good. And then he's at for enough distance. He's kind of chewing, so I'm gonna give him a second here and back up. Ask him to touch the cone, and then I'll click when he feeds or when he touches it. And then I probably should have fed him back there. Like you saw in the first time I asked him to touch the cone, I'm just kind of stretching my arm backwards so that he has to back up to get the food. But I think the reason I didn't there is because I was going to move it to the other side. And he already has a really good grasp on targeting and standing default. He understands what the click means and all that stuff. So this was just because I was doing Mustang Maddie's course and I really wanted to just mess with my other horses because I was using Caster for the course, but I wanted to play with it with other horses. So I just thought this was a good clip to kind of work on teaching horses the default, which is just me staying still with their head straight, and then how I would start teaching like a voice cue or a visual cue to get a horse to touch something on cue. Because in the beginning, it's just seeing that object is going to be the cue, but later on, if you want to teach a visual or a voice cue, this is kind of where I would start. So still working on that staying default, and then now I've asked him to touch the cone. I probably could have been a bit slower about it, and more specific with my body language, and then maybe waited even a little bit longer so that he wasn't chewing, so I didn't have to cue him twice. So, and there you can see I kind of fed back a little bit. Probably could have asked him for another step back so he's not quite so close to the cone, but there we go. Now we get him straightened out. Um, but I do want standing in default to be more reinforcing than touching the cone, so that he wants to stand more often, and he's more likely to wait for my cue. So this is just a little baby session on how to do that. I'm going to end with a jackpot.